Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Mess. So, taking an entertaining series on my favorite beat 'em ups of all time, the type of stuff that's on the B tier that'll never show up on a top 25 list of all time. And if you can't tell already, we're playing Streets of Rage 3 today, but we're technically playing Bare Knuckle 3, because I am playing the Japanese version of the game, which is widely considered to be the better of the two. Now, Streets of Rage 2, and Streets of Rage 4 are considered to be some of the best beat 'em ups of all time. Streets of Rage 3 just kind of doesn't hit that same hallmark for Sega. I'm not saying this is a bad game whatsoever, it's a ton of fun. It's that classic Streets of Rage beat 'em up goodness you know, love, and expect, and it's got some awesome visuals. It's just a little bit redundant compared to the first two games, and the soundtrack is 100% divisive. You'll either love it or hate it. Before we get too far involved, though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined to want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But I remember getting Streets of Rage 3 for Christmas one year, and I was absolutely excited to play the game because the original, and especially Streets of Rage 2, were some of my favorite Sega Genesis games of all time as a kid. So to get Streets of Rage 3 under the Christmas tree was an absolute treat until I opened up the game and played it, and for some reason I just did not really gel with it. And I think it's just because I had played the first two games to death, and honestly, I didn't realize how repetitive games could be if they made too many sequels on the same hardware. Now, decades later, I can appreciate Streets of Rage 3 and Bare Knuckle 3 for what it is. The third entry in a franchise that was trying something new while keeping the same gameplay, succeeding in some spots and failing at the others. This is one of those things, sometimes you just go and take a dip into the well a little bit too much and the well runs dry. Streets of Rage 3 can feel like that if you've played the first two games too quickly close to it. But if you give it some time and approach Streets of Rage 3 from its own standpoint, you can actually find a lot of fun. And I will say right off the top, I absolutely love the graphics in this game. That golden hour sunset right there with the pseudo heat ripples off the sun and the heat look gorgeous on the hardware. This is getting close to like that first gen Neo Geo look to me. I'm not saying it's anywhere near as powerful as the Neo Geo, but it does give me those vibes. And honestly, it's still the same Streets of Rage combat mechanics, which means it's one of the best beat 'em up mechanic games of all time. There's no taking away the fact that Streets of Rage is one of the best games mechanically that Sega ever made, and that was made in the genre. As we pop around in the game, first level 2 and then level 1, this just looks incredible. No matter how you play this game, whether it's on original hardware with an RGB mod, MiSTer FPGA, or emulation, it just looks incredible. But then it does something like give you a boxing kangaroo and a harlequin robot. Some of the game just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. You can tell the artists and the directors of the game were trying to be creative, where they were probably creatively exhausted by working on this franchise a little bit too much. Now, there's nothing wrong with beating up a boxing kangaroo. It's actually kind of funny, but sometimes tonally this game shows you something that doesn't make sense. But then it sends you inside of a nightclub with all of these fun pseudo lighting effects, and you're once again enamored with the game. That's the thing about Streets of Rage 3. You need to look past the little bit of weirdness in the game to get to the absolute 10 out of 10 gems, because this level is just incredible. As a kid, I was blown away by it, and I still think it looks great today. And it's one of those levels and one of those graphical styles. If you have a CRT television, definitely check it out, because I think it looks incredible on a cathode ray tube. Some of these effects just blend so much better with that old technology. But here's the thing about Streets of Rage 3. Maybe you just didn't play it back in the day. Maybe you've heard it's not that good. Maybe you have never checked it out. This should be a reminder to either play it again or play it for the first time, because while it is the weakest of the three games, it's still a B+ tier beat 'em up from Sega, and still an awesome game mechanically and visually. Some levels are just absolutely mind-blowingly fun to look at. That's the type of thing about this game. It is not as good as the first two games, but that does not make it bad. It is third place in a three-man race, but the first two racers are absolute Olympic athletes. This one came in third in the Olympics, if you think about it that way. It is just a fun time. Now, if there's one thing about the game that definitely is divisive, and I can totally understand, it is the soundtrack. It's definitely different than the first two games. It's techno and bass, and it's either a love it or hate it soundtrack, so go ahead and listen and tell me if you love it or hate it. I even don't know what I think of the soundtrack, honestly. Sometimes when I listen to it, I'm totally into it. Other times I just wish it was the music from the first two games stylistically. But you do get a lot of story in Bare Knuckle 3, and it is different than the story in Streets of Rage 3. I can't recommend enough to play the Bare Knuckle 3 version of this game, and maybe just use Google Translate or look at the images, because honestly you can kind of just suss out the story that is here. And it is a very interesting, if not weird, story. Now, one of my favorite things about Bare Knuckle 3 is the detail put into every level. You'll see those construction lights swaying in the breeze as trash goes by. Every single pixel in this game is spectacular when it is used well. This was obviously a very late stage Sega Genesis game, and the Sega Saturn was nipping at its heels, but this shows a technical mastery of the Sega Genesis hardware. I just love the colors, I love the graphics, I love how many sprites they get on screen at once. I just love everything about the graphical style outside of level 1, which honestly starts in a very boring manner. They should have reconfigured the level structure of this game, or kind of reworked level 1 in my opinion, because it starts very bland and gets better. Now, if there's one thing I'm going to give an F- to in this game, it's this stupid bucket loader segment here. You need to destroy these concrete ballards before you can move forward, and it's almost impossible not to take damage. It's like Sega was intentionally trying to slow the game down and make it a little bit harder. It's a quick area to get through, you might take a death here or there, and the ending is absolute slapstick comedy gold, but I don't know why they put this one sequence in, nor do I understand why this bad guy thought that he could just drive that loader directly into a metal girder. He gets a barrel in his head as a reward, but it's one of those things that just makes no sense, but I love it. And of course this qualifies as a capital B beat 'em up because it does have an elevator level. If you've heard anything through this series, it's my insistence that if there's no elevator in a beat 'em up, it doesn't count as a true beat 'em up. But now moving over to Zan, the robot character, this is just absolutely wild. He has rocket skates on, like the wheelie shoes from back in the day. He is half Terminator, half ninja, all 100% ridiculous in the best way possible. And that is the thing about Streets of Rage 3 and Bare Knuckle 3. It's over the top, it's weird, it's always doing something slightly different in the similar formula you're used to from the two games that preceded it, but you're always having fun playing it. It's just one of those titles, if you came to it directly after playing the first two, you might realize it lost a step. If you take a couple years between the first two and this one and play it, you may find that you absolutely love the game, because the internet is not kind to it, but honestly, what is the internet really kind to? And for some of the bosses like Break here, who is a Terminator in disguise, you can basically just 100% cheese the entire fight just by going forward, running, and blocking. And you're going to see here we get a little bit more story, which honestly drops a lot of the music out of the background. It feels like some sections should have music, but you'll see here that is actually a Terminator in disguise. Obviously it's not really a Terminator, but it's the closest amalgam I have to describe it, and it is kind of fun. It reminds me of the Terminator series and Dead of the Brain on PC 98, and that's a very weird comparison to make a beat 'em up to a visual novel. As we move into the fourth level here, this definitely has some vibes of the bar from Streets of Rage 2. It calls back to the earlier games visually while maintaining its own identity. As you go through this area here with these clawed ninjas, you have a train coming towards you. You can go into the cubbies and save yourself, but they can also attach to the walls. But I'm going to give you one more sample of the soundtrack. This one's a little less techno than the first time, and I think you might like it a little better if you didn't like the first one. And I'll come back and tell you a little bit more about the history of Streets of Rage 3 and why I definitely think you should play it. But listen to the audio and leave me a comment down below and tell me if you like this one better than the first one. It's techno, but it's techno kung fu, and I do like that track a little bit than the first one, and it's one of those things, it just depends on how the mood strikes you when you're playing Bare Knuckle 3, whether you think the soundtrack is great or you're just not into it. What I can't argue with is this background here, this pagoda with those glowing lights on the wall. This is a very pretty game, and it basically does feel like the height of graphical ability for the Sega Genesis. You wrap that around an extremely good beat 'em up game that's just not as good as the first two, and you have a solid B tier title. I don't know why this game gets as much hate as it does. It definitely isn't anywhere as good as Streets of Rage 2, but that is the gold standard that you're trying to reach. I just think maybe the developers weren't sure how to innovate on the formula, so they threw some new characters in, made the game a little bit weirder, tried to play around with the soundtrack, and called it a day. I think they did a great job for what's here. It's a hard act to follow on Streets of Rage 2, but I think Streets of Rage 3 definitely does a good job, and it is one of my guilty pleasure favorite beat 'em ups of all time that isn't in that that top 25 list. But short of that, leave me a comment down below. Tell me if you ever played the game before, if you plan on playing it after this video, or what you think about it. But we are done. I'll have more beat 'em ups next week, and I'll have a video out the week. But Zan here is going to keep fighting, and we're going to move on to the next video. See you next time. Bye-bye.